Hello, and welcome to another video lecture for Mr. Mosier's 8th grade American history class. Today's topic is one of our several of our Civil War series looking at African Americans in the U.S. Civil War. So let's start talking here a little bit about the impact that African Americans had on this conflict. So the readings for this particular section looks at pages 530 to 531. Questions that we're going to be looking at is, why did many in the North not want African Americans fighting in the Army? What problems will African American soldiers face? Who was the Massachusetts 54th Regiment? And what was the impact of African American troops following the Battle of Fort Wagner? So let's talk here a little bit about this conflict here in the American Civil War and African Americans' involvement here. So this is a great little photograph here of a African American family in the Civil War. And you can see here, like a lot of people during this time period, this is a pretty new technology, photography is. And here you have a nice little family photograph here of a father and a mother and their children. And again, you see their father dressed in his Union uniform. So what kind of role did African Americans play in the Civil War, especially for the Union Army here? Well, when the war first broke out, there was actually a great deal of resistance to letting African American units and soldiers actually fight. This largely stemmed from two factors. One was just plain old racism. Remember, we looked at an earlier video lecture that looked at kind of the continuum of attitudes of many Northerners. Remember, not all Northerners were these abolitionists who believed in the full emancipation of African Americans and full equality of African Americans. So you had a lot of racist attitudes in the North that African Americans would not fight very effectively, which even though they did very well in the American Revolutionary War, you had this kind of deep-seated racism. Another reason, which is probably more the bigger reason that Lincoln uses to really keep African American soldiers out of the conflict, was concern out of the border states. Remember, those border states of Maryland and Missouri and Kentucky, those were slave-holding states that Lincoln and many Northerners were trying to kind of keep into the Union. And the concern early on was that if we let African American soldiers fight, that this becomes a war about race, a war about ending slavery, and they could maybe lose those border states. However, though, as the war really begins dragging on and casualty numbers just skyrocket and increase, there is starting to become an earnest look at using African American soldiers. Initially, Lincoln is very hesitant of this. In fact, one of his commanders kind of beats him to it early on in the war and lets African American soldiers begin kind of all these slaves that are coming into Union lines because of the Emancipation Proclamation. He starts putting them to work and putting them into combat, and Lincoln says, no, you can't do this. But eventually, as the war does drag on, Lincoln will kind of acquiesce and let the soldiers come in and fight. By the end of the conflict, there will be about 166 regiments that will fight in the U.S. Civil War, and about 500 various battles that we know of. So they will play a very pivotal role, actually, in fact, in this conflict. And in a lot of ways, they provided a much-needed manpower for the North. Remember, for African Americans, this is about ending slavery. They knew that the results of the North winning the war would mean that slavery would be once and for all abolished. So there was a lot of emotional drive for African American soldiers to fight for their country, fight for the Union, to help bring about the end of slavery. That doesn't mean it was easy for them either. There were some problems and some conflicts as well. Traditionally, African American soldiers were paid $10 a month, which originally a white soldier would be paid $13 a month, so they got paid less if captured. The Confederacy, the Confederate Congress, passed a resolution saying that any African American caught fighting for the Union would be either killed or sold back into slavery. And they were not equally equipped as whites either. They did not get necessarily the same amount of supplies that Northern white soldiers received. And again, that stems from some racist attitudes that existed among the Union Army. So here we have another photograph here. This is a 107th Colored Band Regiment. And as you can see here, one of the growing problems, especially early on as the war progressed, was that these were kind of the roles that African American soldiers were delegated to. They were non-combat roles, whether it was cooking or cleaning or clearing shrubs and trees from the land, or playing instruments in part of the band, not necessarily fighting in battles. So they kind of had to really kind of prove themselves, especially early on in the conflict, that they were very capable of doing this. And this brings us into one of the most famous African American regiments, the Massachusetts 54th Regiment. The Massachusetts 54th Regiment was an all-voluntary unit stemmed out of Massachusetts. And it was kind of put together by Northerners that were really looking to show that African Americans could fight in this conflict. And this is probably one of the most famous units that fought, African American units that fought in the American Civil War, probably in large part to a very popular movie that came out in the 1980s called Glory. It was led by a white officer named Colonel Robert Shaw. And that was pretty common for African American regiments. Usually the leaders were of white descent, and the African Americans would maybe go up through what are called non-commissioned officers, up to like sergeant. But in terms of like captains, majors, generals, colonels, that was not much going to happen during the Civil War. So this is a pretty well-known regiment, and it really becomes famous from a particular battle that they fought in called the Battle of Fort Wagner. The Battle of Fort Wagner takes place July 18th, 1863. So this is the same month as the battles of Gettysburg and the same months here as the battle at Vicksburg. So this is a couple weeks later here. This takes place in Charleston, South Carolina, the same hometown of the Fort Sumter and first state that seceded from the Union. The Massachusetts 54th had to cross a 200-yard open sandy beach to reach this particular fort, Fort Wagner. Fort Wagner sat on an island like Fort Sumter, and it was needed to take that fort to continue to move into the harbor to take the city of Charleston. So it was a kind of a strategic location. The downside was this fort was on the middle of a desert, like a sandy island, and you had to cross open beach to get there, which in 200 yards is a lot of open space to be shot and killed, especially with modern technology weapons of the time period, like the mini ball and those new artillery shells. Colonel Shaw will be killed in the assault, as well as about half of the men of the 54th Regiment. Why is this battle important? Well, the Union do end up taking the battle, but pretty high cost. But the 54th Regiment really gained a great deal of respect from this particular assault onto the fort. So previously, before the Battle of Fort Wagner, African Americans were generally viewed as not very capable of fighting in these large-scale land battles like we saw at Fort Wagner. After Fort Wagner, many Union generals begin to sort of change their mind and use African American regiments as a very strong resource. And so there'll be many more very pivotal battles of the Civil War where African American soldiers will take a huge part of. In a lot of ways, these African American soldiers are going to be the much needed manpower that Lincoln and the Union need to win the war. So that's African Americans' involvement in the Civil War. Very, very important involvement, especially as the war gets into its last few years, 1863, and then in 1864 and 1865, especially in the North, Union African American soldiers are going to be a huge pivotal asset for the North as they begin to march closer and closer, hopefully to war, though that at this point in time in 63 and 64, that doesn't seem inevitable yet. There's still a lot of fighting left to go. So thank you for listening, and always, if you have questions, please make sure you come talk to your teacher.